There's a number of different issues. And in a way, because of that, that's why there's such strong bipartisan support for this. Every so often, you'll hear a story about a home blowing up, and that's typically because they didn't know that there was an orphan well that was 3 feet away from their foundation, and somebody lights a match, and then it explodes.
Have you ever stopped to think about what might be buried beneath the ground you live, you work, or where your children even play? Now, across North America, millions of abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells remain scattered across our landscape. Many have been forgotten. Some are leaking methane and invisible gas that possesses environmental and public safety risks, while others continue to leave taxpayers, governments, and industries grappling with a question that grows more urgent every year. Who is responsible for cleaning them up? Welcome back to the Markets and Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Lyndsay Malchuk. This is one of those conversations that extends far beyond energy. It's about accountability. It's about the legacy we leave behind, and it's about what happens when yesterday's solutions become today's challenges. My guest today is someone who has spent years examining this issue from every angle. Catherine Flax has built a career leading global financial institutions, advising on infrastructure and capital allocation, and today is helping shape the conversation around one of North America's largest environmental liabilities. She believes that solving the orphan well challenge isn't simply about cleaning up the past. It's about rethinking how we value environmental responsibility, how we finance long-term solutions, and how governments, industry, and private capital can work together to tackle a problem that no single group can solve alone. Today, we're going to explore just how serious this issue is really, what's at stake if it isn't addressed, where meaningful progress is already being made, and the biggest obstacles that still stand in the way. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the show and sitting down with us.
Lyndsay, it is always a pleasure. It's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, let's get into it. I mean, for people hearing the term orphan well just for the first time, what exactly is an orphan well, and why has this become such an important issue across North America?
I'm amazed at how few people I speak with that do know what this is all about. Most people have never heard of this.
No clue.
And right. And it really starts with the fact that the first oil wells were drilled in the United States in the 1850s. And most people think that this is something that happened, well into the 1900s. Not so. And so you can imagine that, putting ourselves in the position of people who would have been in that nascent industry over 100 years ago, it looked like there was an infinite amount of land and, infinite amount of resources. And so, I don't like to think about this as, well, those idiots, what were they doing? You know what I mean? It's not that. It's just that they didn't know. And so you have people drilling wells, 1850s, 1860s, and so on, so on, so on. And it wasn't until the 1960s that a regulation existed in the United States saying, hey, you know what, if you drill a well, you probably want to go ahead and clean that up. In fact, you have to. So that's over 100 years of wells being drilled and not really it being thought of as maybe that's an issue that you're going to have toxic methane leaking into the air and benzene and maybe hydrogen sulfide. And then, you're going to have oil that's leaking into your water table that's going to make your water undrinkable and so on. So part of it, this is not about bad people doing bad things. It's not about stupid people. It's not about bad industries. It's about education and understanding what are the implications for us, not just as business people, but as citizens of a country, as parents and grandparents. Like, what are we trying to solve for here that makes it so that the resources that, in fact, are not infinite can be used better for generations to come?
Well, you made a good point there. I mean, these weren't like idiot people that were doing this. They were using the best knowledge and technology they had for that time of day. And unfortunately, I did a post about this on LinkedIn too. We're leaving a legacy behind. And what is that legacy looking like? And right now, there's a huge challenge there. And you're right. There's a lot of people that have no idea that this even existed. I mean, me included. I just thought, okay, oil and gas, they get what they want and they take it out and that's that. But there's something that is left behind. And when we were doing the documentary for your company Zefiro, walking onto this man's property, you would never know that the little tiny mine was, or the little tiny oil and gas well was there. But the closer I got, the stronger that scent was. And I know methane itself doesn't have the scent, but the other toxic chemicals coming out of it, you
100%.
could smell it. 100%, right? So, and that is a huge safety concern. And I'm surprised actually that there has not been more education about this.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
think,
absolutely. And I think what happens is it's necessity that causes people to know what it is. Like one of the instances that we were asked to come in and remediate a well was a business office. A company had built an office in the 1970s, and people started getting really ill. Everybody in the building was having headaches and was just getting really sick. And they called the Department of Environmental Services in their state and learned that there was an oil well there, or a gas well that had been drilled, and it hadn't been plugged. They just paved over it to make the parking lot. And again, not because they're stupid, that people didn't know,
they
so they
don't
just
know.
paved over it thinking, well, that's probably good enough. And then it did stop the methane from leaking up into the air, but it forced it, laterally under the ground into the building. And all those
Into the
people were getting
vents.
methane poisoning. So we had to tear up the parking lot, correctly remediate the well, and then repave so that they could actually have a safe working environment. So I guarantee you all those people understand now, right? Because that's how you
Now,
learn.
yeah. Well, I think most people hear the explanations you and I just gave and immediately assume this is just another environmental story. But, it is, as you mentioned, it's a much bigger story than that. I mean, how serious is this challenge really? If we continue at our current pace, what are the long-term consequences of leaving these wells unaddressed?
There's a number of different issues. And in a way, because of that, that's why there's such strong bipartisan support for this, because there are people who are coming at this and looking at it and saying it's ruining the water table, because it is in a lot of places. It's making the air toxic. And, there have been studies and things like that done around areas of concentration where there's a lot of leaking wells, and the illnesses that the people are getting around those areas and so on. So there's those sorts of things that are causing people to say, we just need to fix this because we need to make our air cleaner, our water cleaner. But then in addition, every so often you'll hear a story about a home blowing up, and that's typically because they didn't know that there was an orphan well that was 3 feet away from their foundation, and somebody lights a match, and then it explodes. But the other thing that we're seeing too is that it's an impediment to growth of infrastructure in our country. You simply can't build a data center or distribution center or a power plant or an LNG facility on top of these leaking wells, because you're going to have invested billions of dollars in something that is going to explode, or the people are going to get sick, or whatever it is. So
Gosh.
it's for a number of different reasons that this becomes a very acute issue for us to solve as a nation. And I say as a nation, but really, our focus is North America. But this problem exists everywhere in the world where there's
Everywhere, yeah.
been hydrocarbon extraction.
What risk do you think concerns you the most out of all the risks?
I mean, it's
I
hard
mean,
not to be most worried about things blowing up, right? I
of
mean,
course.
so that's an obvious one. I think the other thing too is that you can imagine that back when a lot of these wells were drilled, they were out in the middle of nowhere. Now they're in cities and suburbs and things like that, because we've sprawled into those areas. And so, I think we've talked about this before, that 14 million Americans are estimated to live within a mile of a leaking well. I
Right?
guarantee you that most of those 14 million Americans have no idea.
They
Um,
have no idea.
right. And so the health issues that come with that too that's really problematic.
It
So
is.
it's hard to prioritize, but I have to go with like instant death as being sort of the top of the list.
Absolutely. Why then should someone living in a city care about a well that may actually be even hundreds of miles away?
It might be, although there are wells in Los Angeles and places like that. I mean, people think that they're not there, but they are.
They are.
So just living in a city doesn't necessarily exempt you.
Yeah.
But still, I think, the question becomes, what responsibilities do we have as citizens is one thing. But the other thing too is like, look, the reality is that the governments, state and federal governments, are ultimately the ones who this liability reverts to. So whether people like it or not, their tax dollars are going to this remediation. So if you're going to be spending it, you probably want it to be done correctly.
I couldn't agree more. Now, I know that we've talked about methane throughout this conversations and other conversations we've had, but I don't think many people truly understand why scientists and policymakers are so focused on it. Can you explain why methane is such an urgent issue? Like, what makes it different from other greenhouse gases? And further to that, actually, why is reducing methane emissions considered one of the fastest opportunities to make a meaningful environmental impact?
Sure. What we're hearing a lot now is the concept of super pollutants. And so methane is in the super pollutant bucket. So if you compare it to CO2 in terms of greenhouse gases, it's about 80 times more potent. And I would say that alone is important. However, I do think that there's political toing and froing around. Do we care about CO2? Do we not care about CO2? And from my perspective, the fact that methane will kill you it kind of removes the ambiguity around, is this a problem that's, my grandchildren's grandchildren are going to deal with, or is this a today problem? This is both. It's both a today problem and a tomorrow problem. And so I think that's also where, in a positive sense, why it's getting a lot of attention, because also when you start to mitigate it, you actually are seeing, material improvements in things like air quality, water quality, and things like that. So it's kind of like, if you're going to spend money on something, wouldn't you want to spend it on something that pretty much anybody, this is not a debatable thing. Literally light a match and you will blow up. So, it's not like there's not a philosophical problem here. It's a really tangible problem. So I think, I would argue that if we're going to prioritize where we're going to spend money on any sort of remediation or any sort of cleanup or any sort of environmental issue or anything that's around how to make this our country more investable or our neighborhoods healthier or whatever, hard to find something that is more attractive than spending dollars on getting this cleaned up.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. So I know that recognizing the problem is one thing, but solving it is something entirely different. So, Catherine, when you look at the orphan well landscape today, where are the biggest obstacles? Is it funding or regulation? Is it identifying these wells in the first place? Or is it simply overwhelming amount of scale and challenge altogether?
I mean, certainly the scale is overwhelming. And so, as you know, the federal government allocated about $4.8 billion. And those dollars are now flowing to the states, and the states are for the most part doing a good job now of getting those dollars out and spent on the remediation of wells. But the problem is probably somewhere around a $400 to $600 billion problem. So $4.8 billion is a great start, but it's very much just that. And so that's where I think, finding ways of accelerating that, the remediation is probably one of the most significant challenges. And the reality too, and I mean, this is it's good for business, the fact that there aren't enough companies out there skilled to do this work. And so certainly that's a benefit to us as a company. But I do think that and it's a growth opportunity, but it is also a challenge. Like, it's not as though there's a pathway to even if you took $400 billion and said, okay, well, let's spend that tomorrow, which of course is not going to happen. But even if it did, you wouldn't have the people and the machinery necessary to do it. So it is a growth opportunity.
So there is government funding there for sure, but that's only like 2%, as you said.
Right.
So where does the rest of the solution then come from? Where do you think it should lie? For me personally, and it's my biased opinion, it should come from the oil and gas industry. But where does that solution come from right now?
Well, and to be clear, I mean, the oil and gas industry since the 1960s has been quite active in this. Our client base is, large oil and gas companies, and these are very responsible companies that are complying with the necessary regulations, and that varies on a state by state basis, but it's all becoming more onerous, and they're stepping up and doing it. So
Right.
there is I think a clear understanding. And again, I'm talking about the larger oil and gas companies. We're not dealing with sort of the mom and pop, I have two wells in my yard kind of thing, which is a bit of what has caused the problem anyway, because they go bankrupt and those wells become orphaned. But the larger companies, I think, both because they just recognize, the requirement, but also, I mean, we've seen it in other areas as well, where a lot of the bigger oil and gas companies are trying to green both their image, but also the reality. They're investing in cleaner energy and other things as well. So the I think the overall energy complex is favorable to
Right.
spending more, doing more, and they are. Um, but that doesn't do much with the backlog. And the reason there are orphan wells is because there is nobody in the chain of title. If there were, they would be on the hook. But,
Hmm.
long ago, those companies went under. And so there's nobody there. So those do revert to the state. Um, and even though, I mean, I take your point, you could say, well, okay, they revert to the state, but as an industry, the oil and gas industry, it was behind this. Fair. But we also are consumers of oil and gas, like every day, whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not, we're all consuming hydrocarbons. And so we all are part of this ecosystem. And so what do we do? Well, the reality is today, the states, if it's on federal land, the federal governments are holding the bag on this. And so then the question is, what's the most efficient and economic way of addressing this problem? And I think some states are quite thoughtful about this. Like, we've had states hire us to measure the methane emissions from all of the orphan wells. And that's kind of smart because it gives them an opportunity to say, well, actually, let's start with the most offensive leakers and remediate those first. That seems like a smart thing to do. So there's that kind of an approach. The other thing, though, which I think is maybe again not widely understood, is there is a carbon credit market available for the mitigation of leaking methane from orphan wells. It's a nascent market. We've been, fortunate to be able to generate those carbon credits and sell them. But I think it's going to be a growing market because it's a private sector solution to this problem that's effectively another source of funds coming into this. And the reason why there is a market for it at all is that there is, as we know, a proliferation of data centers in the United States and around the world. And a lot of those companies have taken their carbon footprint commitments to be net zero very seriously. And so they're going to be kind of blowing right through those commitments. And so now they're looking for ways to offset. So that's one reason why. We also
Yeah.
know that, like in Europe and Japan, they have a carbon tax. So if they're importing LNG or other hydrocarbons, they're going to be taxed on the carbon intensity. So there's an economic incentive to offset with carbon credits. And so it's less expensive, frankly, to generate a carbon credit by abating methane from an orphan well than it is to pay the carbon tax in Europe. So
Right.
there's market solutions, again, nascent market solutions, but I think that can be part of the solution here.
So, do you believe maybe that orphan well remediation represents one of those opportunities where doing good for the environment can also create economic value? Or how do you see governments, industries, and maybe private capital working together to accelerate that progress?
I mean, I certainly do. And I think that that's one of the things that excites me about the work that we do broadly, whether it's for governments or
Yeah.
for corporates or whatever, is it's one of those opportunities where you can do well in business and do good for the world. And those don't come every day. So it feels good to be
Okay.
able to get up every day and kind of work on something that fits into that bucket. So I like that a lot personally. Um, and yeah, I do think that there's other opportunities to partner with the public sector and the private sector, and develop markets like for carbon credits and so on, to be able to do this in a more thoughtful way. And we're seeing that. I think the states, they've now had a couple years of this, and it is things like prioritizing the wells that are leakiest and plugging those first. Like, there's an education process, I think, in the public sector as well, on how to do this more wisely, and get more bang for their buck, which is important. As a taxpayer, I want that too.
So, there are certainly challenges. And as you mentioned, there is certainly reasons to be optimistic. Catherine, where are you seeing the greatest progress today?
Um, it's a good question. There's a number of different ways I could answer that because there's,
Well, let,
where like geographically where, and then there's where sort of like, in terms of like where industrially where. I mean, I think one of the things that we haven't really touched on that I think is a place where there's a tremendous amount of progress is companies that are not oil and gas companies, but that are building infrastructure. Um, they buy a property, they want to build whatever they want to build. They find that there are orphan wells on the property. They could say, hey, that's the state's problem. And I'm going to wait the next, I don't know, 20 years, 40 years, 50 years before the state gets around to plugging those wells. Probably not. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, you know what, it's worth it to me to spend $5 million plugging these wells because I have a $5 billion facility that I'm going to be building. And so the
right.
economics make it so that, it makes sense for them to dip into their pockets to do that. So I do think we're seeing that in our business. That's a growing area. And I think that as we have more and more infrastructure developments in this country and around the world, there are those sorts of pockets of money to address this problem too, that can be another sort of quiver or arrow in the quiver of the solution set.
Do you think that's one of the things right now that gives you confidence that we're finally moving in the right direction? Is there anything else as well?
I think the nonpartisan part of this that I mentioned before on the government side is absolutely key because, it's not just in the United States, it's around the world where, you have a very divided political situation and people are just find every reason to fight over stuff. The fact that we found something that everybody can hold hands on and say like, you know what, that's a good idea. I struggle to find another topic that is so uniformly positive on all different, political kind of persuasions. That gives me a lot of confidence as well that this is going to continue and we're going to be able to get this done.
Oh, so great to hear. I want to step back just a little bit here. You're with Zefiro, and I would like the audience to learn a little bit about Zefiro. So why don't you just hand over the mic to you and just let us know, like, what is Zefiro? What are you doing? What's your goals here?
Sure. Thank you. We're an environmental solutions business. And the biggest part of our business is plugging oil and gas wells, both for corporates as well as for governments. It sounds like a simple process, but when you think about having wells that are thousands and thousands of feet deep, that could be spewing all sorts of toxins that could have come from the late 1800s and so on, it's a very engineering intensive, complex problem. It requires skilled labor. And so we're proud with the fact that we have a tremendously strong health and safety record. We have a lot of excellent training of personnel. So we're developing a workforce to do more and more of this. And we really are the only sort of pure play environmental services company focused on this sector that's a publicly traded company in North America. And so we're growing rapidly. The opportunity is tremendous. And we're really pleased with how the reception that we continue to get from businesses and governments.
Your story is absolutely phenomenal. You don't just do the remediation of the actual well, you do the remediation of the ground around it too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. No, I mean, the point really is how do you restore the land to be usable in a way that it would have been had there not been any hydrocarbon extraction. And so this is where we have a lot of different disciplines within our company to be able to address the very specific needs. And as you might imagine, it's very, very different plugging a well on a hillside in West Virginia than it is right outside of, let's say, Philadelphia, 3 feet away from someone's home. So the
Right.
fact that the team, is able to design solutions for many different kinds of landscapes, but to your point, be able to come in after the fact and, maybe excavate extensive amounts of polluted soil and return into its original state. It's all very
Beautiful.
project specific because we're in all sorts of different places throughout the United States, but with the ultimate goal being the same, is that you want to restore it to where it can be safe and usable again for whoever it is that is going to develop that property or enjoy that
Wow.
property.
I absolutely am so enamored by your story and the legacy that you're leaving behind too, for not just this coming generation, but the next and the next and the next. And really, we're using the technology and knowledge that we have now, but your company is also looking forward, going, let's leave it a better place than when we got it.
That's right.
So that's
100%. That's
a
really
huge
what it's all
thing,
about, And I mean,
right?
I think it's really important as a citizen of a country to think about, like, how can we leave it better for the next generation? But as a parent and a grandparent, like, it's important that we think about the impact of what we're doing. But equally, I'm a shareholder of our company. And so it's also important to build a company that's sustainable and profitable, and that we're doing the best thing we can do for shareholders every day. So all of those things are very, very important.
Right? Okay, let's push back a little bit here and we'll finish off with the bigger picture. If someone's listening to this conversation, remembers just one thing about it, what do you hope it is?
That Zefiro is the leader in the space of environmental remediation when it comes to end-of-life oil and gas wells.
Perfect. I love that. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today and for helping bring attention to an issue that really impacts far more people, far more industries, far more safety things than most people actually realized. Thank you again.
Thank you.
If today's conversation has taught us anything, it's that orphaned and abandoned wells aren't simply a reminder of our past, they're a test of how we choose to move forward in our future. The challenge is enormous, but so is the opportunity to restore land, reduce methane emissions, protect communities, protect our families, create jobs, and rethink what responsible energy development looks like for future generations. This isn't a problem that will be solved overnight, but meaningfully, progress is beginning with awareness, information, conversations, and the willingness to take responsibility for the legacy we've inherited. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Markets and Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Lyndsay Malchuk. Remember, these are the opinions of our own with possible vested interest in any or all of the companies that we may have spoken about. This is not to be used for financial advice. Always be sure to speak with your licensed financial advisor and know your own risk tolerances. For a copy of our complete disclaimer, head over to apaton.com. We'll see you next time.